here we go. You guys should be able to see my screen. Do you see that correctly? Thanks, Erin. Okay, so before we begin, I was looking at the list of participants and I wanted to get a little bit more information on kind of your general understanding of things. So if everybody looks in the reactions button. So if you look, it should be, if you're looking at the screen, in the bottom of the screen, there should say reactions. And you should see a thumbs up button. I want you to go ahead and click that thumbs up if you are familiar with the FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. So go ahead and give me that thumbs up if you are familiar with it. Okay, because that's going to help me kind of understand how much background I should give. Okay, perfect. So a good number of you guys answered. It looks like there's a mixed bag. A number of you are familiar with it, but there were a couple that responded that they were not. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit more, start off with a little bit about some background on the FSMA, on the Food Safety Modernization Act, specifically the Produce Safety Rule, before I delve into some of the big requirements. And between this talk and next Wednesday, when I'm gonna talk more about some of the compost specific requirements, together, I think you should get a pretty good idea of what is required in the regulation. So with that, I will introduce myself before I go any further. My name is Donna. I work for the Produce Safety Alliance. So I work in extension. The Produce Safety Alliance is based out of Cornell University. So if anybody in the attendance, and I recognize some familiar names, has attended a PSA grower training course, we developed that course and we helped sort of mentor and train a network of trainers across the country and internationally. So that's a big part of my job. And I've been able over the last couple of years to work with ALDA on a research project and outreach project on soil amendments. Okay, so again, a couple of background slides for those of you who are comfortable with the Produce Safety Rule, bear with me. But for those of you who are not familiar with this regulation, you will hear me use the acronym FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act. This is a 7-part rule. So we will primarily talk about the Produce Safety Rule over the next 20-25 minutes or so. But there are 7 different rules within the Food Safety Modernization Act. Because we're talking about soil amendments, that really primarily applies to the Produce Safety Rule. So we won't really talk about Preventive Controls Rule, Foreign Supplier Verification Program, but I do just want you to be familiar with the fact that FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act, really encompasses that whole food system. So from the production, the growing of food, to shipping, if it's being imported into the United States, FSMA is really going to cover all of that. But we are going to focus mostly on the Produce Safety Rule, specifically the soil amendment requirements in the rule. And those of you who are in attendance, it looks like there are quite a few growers here. You may be familiar with other food safety requirements. So because we're talking, I think mostly everybody's in California, you guys might be familiar with the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement, or LGMA requirements. Alda talked a little bit about those in her presentation. What sets the FSMA Produce Safety Rule apart is that it is a federal regulation. So unlike the National Organic Program, or LGMA, or Primus, or other good agricultural practices food safety audits, the Produce Safety Rule is a required regulation for those farms that are large enough, or for those farms that fall under the requirements of the rule. So that's really what sets it apart. It is a regulation as opposed to a buyer requirement or market-driven requirement. And it does cover the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce. So again, because we're mostly talking about soil amendments, we're really going to be focusing in on growing requirements. And again, I'm going to allude to this a little bit later, but markets may have their own expectations and requirements beyond the regulations. And I will talk a little bit about the federal requirements that I share with you here being what we view as kind of baseline requirements. They kind of set the the floor, and a lot of other food safety requirements you'll see will be more strict. So this is going to tie in with a presentation that I believe Aaron is giving on some of the California Department of Food and Agriculture findings for soil amendments during the initial produce safety rule inspections. But when we talk about the compliance dates for the produce safety rule, I want to highlight, you see this column that's in a red square, that the compliance dates for most of the requirements in the produce safety rule are already here. So you'll see that this chart, anybody who's attended the grower training course is probably very familiar with this chart, but it's setting the compliance dates by farm size based on total produce sales. So we have those large farms or greater than $500,000. They were expected to comply with the produce safety rule back in 2018. And then as we get to the smaller farms, very small businesses were expected to comply in 2020. I know that due to COVID and everything, I think inspections are still rolling out, especially in California. There's quite a few farms to get to. But the compliance dates for the soil amendment requirements are here. And I know in the next webinar series in May, they're going to talk more about water. And I expect they'll probably address some of the water related compliance dates. But this will tie back into Aaron's talk a little bit later on some of the CDFA inspection findings on soil amendments. Okay, and to wrap up this overview of the produce safety rule, just to set the stage for anybody who's new to the topic, the produce safety rule includes growing, harvesting, and packing requirements that address a number of different contamination sources. So everything from worker health and hygiene, really humans, that worker health and hygiene, this component covers everything, including when we're talking about soil amendments, because I'm going to mention some requirements and recommendation for handling practices for soil amendments to try to minimize contamination. And then, of course, we are going to talk about soil amendments, and then water, buildings, equipment, tools, and animals. But there are really, the produce safety rule addresses this whole gamut of potential sources of contamination. And here's the same information, just organized slightly differently. But here we list all of the subparts of the produce safety rule. And I highlighted in orange subpart F, which is biological soil amendments of animal origin and human waste. I saw somebody ask that in the chat box. So I think what we're going to do is go through the presentations, and then when Aaron does the Q&A, we'll make sure to talk about some of those requirements if anybody is using biosolids or human waste. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and just make sure there are no questions. I believe you guys are able to unmute yourselves if there are questions, or you can ask it in the chat box. Okay, because at this point, we're going to get past some of the very general information on the produce safety rule and move more into specifically biological soil amendments of animal origin and how the produce safety rule regulates and sets those requirements. And I'll introduce this topic of using treatment status as a way to determine the risk of that soil amendment. So the approach that the produce safety rule takes, or that FDA takes in the produce safety rule, is asking growers, what type of soil amendment are you using? And is it treated or not treated? And the idea here is that treatment status really affects how the soil amendment is regulated and how it's used and handled on the farm. So specifically, we're going to talk a little bit more today and then next week as well. But when we talk about treatment status and how it's used, this will impact whether that soil amendment is allowed to come in contact with the harvestable portion of the crop. So when I say harvestable portion, I mean everything from oranges like citrus to leafy greens to potentially root crops like onions, carrots, things like that. So is that soil amendment allowed to even touch the harvestable portion of the crop, whether it's recommended or not? And then what is the timing of application that's allowed? And that treatment status is going to really impact those requirements in the rule. And just to be very straightforward, because this will change how I present the following slides, the produce safety rule really establishes two different treatment statuses at the broad level. So they establish untreated soil amendments, and Alda gave some examples of those, such as raw manure, and then treated soil amendments. And we're going to spend a lot more time next week talking about treated soil amendments and some of those treatment processes. As Alda mentioned earlier, there are some risks to using untreated soil amendments. And the next few slides you're going to see, I really focus on untreated soil amendments. The reason, as Alda showed, is that some animals can be reservoirs for certain pathogens. Alda mentioned that E. coli 0157H7, we're going to get into that a little bit later. Salmonella, Listeria monocytogenes we hear about in cattle often, or other ruminants. And because the basic fact is that because untreated soil amendments are not treated, they have not gone through a thermophilic or heat treatment step, then they are going to be higher risk because those pathogens likely have not been killed off. And at the basic level, we do recommend prioritizing use with non-produce crops. So sometimes I work with smaller growers who essentially are using raw manure because they have to get rid of it. So they're almost using it as a recycling step on the farm. They have this waste product and they're applying it to fields because they really want to get rid of it. They're not even using it as their primary soil building or fertility practice. And for those farms, I usually try to recommend that if possible, say they have cover crop fields or sweet corn or crops that are not produce or they're not high risk crops, I will usually recommend that they try to prioritize that soil amendment for those crops. But often that's not the case because they really are trying to use manure as a soil building, for a soil building purpose. And as Alda mentioned, when we look at reducing risk due to using untreated soil amendments, we can kind of categorize it into two different methods. The first one is applying a time interval between application and harvest. And I have a visual for that in a couple of slides, but essentially the idea is that over time, pathogens in the soil will die off because these human pathogens cannot compete as well with environmental organisms. And then the second method that we're going to talk about much more next week is applying a treatment to the soil amendment. And that's really where composting often comes in. Okay, so Alda also showed you a very similar slide, so I'm going to breeze through this, but I want to highlight a couple of examples of untreated soil amendments. So obviously the first one that pops into at least my mind, or most people's mind, when I say untreated soil amendment is raw manure. Of course, it's raw, it's stinky, it's really heavy, it's full of nitrogen. That's going to be an untreated soil amendment. But there are some that when we talk through these examples in grower training courses, people often have questions about. So things like agricultural teas with supplemental microbial nutrients. And we are actually going to talk about this in 2 weeks. I think Pat Milner is going to talk much more about compost teas. So I won't say very much here because we are going to revisit that. But agricultural teas, so usually a compost tea would be made when there's a treated soil amendment and it's mixed with water that is microbially safe. So it's mixed with water that is free of generic E. coli. And that technically is considered a treated soil amendment. But on certain farms, it's a very common practice to add in molasses or other microbial nutrients as a way to jumpstart sort of that microbial activity. Because when we talk about using compost teas, it's often in a protective manner. So compost teas are being used to fight plant pathogens and kind of induce that systemic response. So I just want to highlight that once any supplemental microbial nutrients are added to a compost tea, it's actually going to revert back to an untreated soil amendment status. And I just want to highlight that because there's often questions there. And then in a similar point, the last bullet, any soil amendment that's mixed with raw manure. So I've worked with growers who will often take a compost, and then they'll add a little bit of raw manure in, mix it in as a way, again, to jumpstart the microbial activity. And that's for the same reason it's considered contaminating your pile or contaminating your compost so for the same reason, that would go back to being considered an untreated soil amendment. Okay, and I am monitoring the chat box, so if there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself or put it in the chat box. Okay, so as we continue this discussion of untreated soil amendments, I wanted to talk a little bit about the application interval that's currently required or not in the FSMA produce safety rule. So when I say an application interval, I am talking about the length of time that farmers have to wait between applying a soil amendment and harvesting that crop. And just to be clear, as it currently stands in the FSMA produce safety rule, there is no established application interval. So a little bit of background, when the FSMA produce safety rule was proposed back in, I think that was about 2013 or so, when it was originally proposed, FDA wrote in a requirement for a 9-month application interval. And that was going off of some very basic research that was being done. And in the rulemaking process, the way it works is that the regulatory body proposes a rule, and then they have to wait for a comment period. So as the comments rolled in, it became very clear that the agricultural industry generally was not supportive of a 9-month application interval. Because if you think about using a soil amendment in production, especially if it's like vegetable production or not perennial production, you can't, a 9-month application interval just wouldn't allow it to work. So what FDA ended up doing is when they published the final produce safety rule, they reserved, so they pulled back that requirement. And if you look at that section in the rule, it says reserved. And what FDA is doing is that they are pursuing additional research. And actually one of the projects I know that ALDA is working on is looking at some of this information about how long does it take for pathogens to die off. And I expect we'll probably talk about that next week. So what should growers do now currently in the interim as we wait for that established application interval in the rule? Because we know research takes a lot of time. So I can probably pretty confidently say we can't expect an interval anytime soon. So what the current recommendation is to use those national organic program intervals. So anybody who is familiar with the NOP program, you may have heard of the 90 or 120-day rule in the past. And essentially what this says is that growers have to wait 90 days between applying a raw manure or an untreated soil amendment and harvesting that crop. And then it's 90 days if the crop is off the ground. So something like, I would usually use sweet corn, but that's not covered under the rule. But something like staked tomatoes, anything that it is very safely never going to touch the ground. Or waiting 120 days, which is a little bit longer, between applying the soil amendment, harvesting the crop, if that crop touches the ground, something like cantaloupes or whatnot. And that's the current recommendation for an application interval, because there's not yet a regulated, there's not yet an application interval in the FSMA produce safety rule. The other big thing I want to highlight here is that untreated soil amendments such as raw manure must be applied in a way that minimizes contact with produce. And that is a big requirement, is that when an untreated manure is used, it cannot contact the produce. Because if you think about it, it's not treated, so that's going to be significantly higher risk. Okay, so we are going to talk more about this next week, but I wanted to give you a quick visual because we are talking about pathogen die-off. So this is a quick visual. If you look at the bottom of the slide, this is a figure from, this is an older slide I just put in after I heard Aldo's talk. And what you can see here, this is die-off of E. coli 0157H7, which is a human pathogen. So if you look at the y-axis here, we have concentration of E. coli as it was applied to soil in a field. And what you have in the horizontal axis is the number of days as they progress. And the big take home that I want you to take from this visual is that over time, these pathogens generally die off. But you can see here that there are some spikes. But the big take home is I wanted to show you that once soil amendments are, such as raw manure, is applied out in the field, oftentimes over time, the pathogens will die off. And there's a couple of reasons that you can see on this slide that they are likely to die off. First of all, is when you think about human pathogens, oftentimes they just don't compete as well as other environmental organisms. So if you think about other soil-borne organisms, we're going to hear more about them next week, they just don't really compete. They're used to being in a human's intestine, you know, it's warm, it has a lot of food, and they don't have to work as hard to get their nutrients and their moisture. And then some of the other reasons is that there is a limited availability of nutrients and carbon. So again, this just goes to competition. And then UV light. There is some research that shows that soil amendments that have been applied through a surface application will die off due to the UV light. Again, they just essentially get sterilized. And then there are also other adverse environmental conditions. Things like soil moisture plays a big part. There have been some other studies done that when there is what they call a rain event, so when it rains, the soil moisture goes up, and they'll often see a little spike in available or in pathogens in the soil because of that soil moisture. So I just want to show you here, and this is just a very simplistic snapshot, but there are a number of factors that influence pathogen die-off. And this is, I think, one of the reasons that there's so much research being done. And Alda talked a little bit about that earlier. But it is a relatively complicated topic. It's not easy to just say, okay, if you wait 120 days, probably the pathogens are going to be dead. And that's part of the reason there's just a lot of research. Okay, so again, we are going to visit this again slightly differently next week, but I wanted to just give you that snapshot of untreated soil amendments, some of the risks, some of the application intervals, before we shift gears into talking about treated soil amendments. And these next slides are going to be even more of an overview because this is really the topic of next week's webinar. Okay, so growers can use a soil amendment that has undergone a scientifically valid treatment to reduce risks. And in the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, they really establish two different composting methods. And both of these are based on a thermophilic, meaning part of the treatment process is that soil amendment heats up to over 131 degrees Fahrenheit, an aerobic process, which means that it heavily relies on aerobic microorganisms, so oxygen-loving microorganisms to help process that feedstock. And there's also some good amount of research showing that through this composting methods, in addition to the heat, microbial diversity and competition also is very important in having pathogens die off. And I want to highlight here that the two methods that the Produce Safety Rule establishes are both acceptable methods in the National Organic Program. So any growers who are listening in who are organic growers, these are both composting methods that are actually also listed in the USDA National Organic Program. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we are talking about this next week, but the two different methods highlighted in the rule are turned or windrow composting and aerated static composting. And the numbers that you see here on the slide, as I said, they do align directly with the NOP. So there shouldn't be any issue with organic growers who are using these treatment processes already. Okay, so Alda showed very similar information in her presentation. This is based on a national survey of organic growers that she discussed. And I just wanted to, now that I talked a little bit about treatment processes, I wanted to tie the survey information back into some of the treatment processes that I showed you. And as she mentioned earlier, her national survey showed that 48% of organic growers surveyed use compost. And the second bullet talked a little bit about where was this compost either purchased from or was it made on the farm? And I found this information very helpful. So the majority of compost used by those growers that were surveyed was purchased commercially, 75%, followed by on-site production. So about 50% of those growers actually made compost on the farm. And in terms of the main treatments that growers were using, about 65% used windrow, and then 22% used aerated static piles. So of the growers surveyed, the majority of them were using composting treatments that were that are outlined in the produce safety rule already, which I found interesting. Okay, so as I mentioned, next week is all about composting. So I'm going to kind of save the rest of the produce safety rule details for that discussion next week. But I wanted to revisit this question of what happens if you are a grower and your treatment is not validated. So it's not one of the validated treatments in the produce safety rule, or it's not validated to meet certain microbial criteria that are established in the rule. And the short answer is if either the treatment process is not adequate or if records are not kept, and this is a big thing that we're going to talk about next, then growers must consider that the soil amendment is untreated, and this would be considered the same category as untreated manure. And of course, this limits growers' flexibility in using the product. And we are going to talk a little bit about record keeping because this is something that I get a lot of questions on about what are the record keeping requirements. And I think this is something that Erin is going to talk about as well. Okay, so I did want to highlight, I mentioned this, that the FSMA produce safety rule is considered baseline requirements. So anybody listening in the audience, you may be thinking of other industry standards that you work with that are much more strict. The Leafy Greens marketing agreement comes to mind. I know that they're very strict on the use of untreated soil amendments, and that I know it was a 1-year application interval, and it might be a little bit different now. I also know that LGMA has revised soil amendment standards that are currently under comment. And then another one that I often hear about is the US Composting Council, their testing analysis requirements. So just know that we like to consider the produce safety rule kind of baseline requirements. The other thing I want to highlight, and this is a question that came in, is asking about product testing. So product testing, so testing soil amendments, is not a requirement in the produce safety rule. The requirement is that records need to be kept that demonstrate a validated treatment process was performed and handled properly. And I'm sure this might come up again in the Q&A. So I just wanted to mention that there is no lot by lot testing requirement in the produce safety rule for soil amendments. Okay, I wanted to address some additional requirements that are in the produce safety rule. And these are both for handling and then storage we're going to talk about next. So when we talk about requirements and recommendations for handling soil amendments, this might be treated soil amendments or untreated soil amendments. We ask that there is designated specific equipment and tools. So think about, if there's a smaller farm and they're using a front end loader, likely that front end loader is going to be used for turning the windrow pile, might also be used for moving other things around the farm. So think about either having specific equipment or a procedure that's established for cleaning and sanitizing, for example, that front end loader or that shovel on a smaller scale farm. And then also directing traffic around storage and processing areas to reduce the risk of cross-contamination. And I love this picture here. You can see there is, I believe it's raw manure in a pile under the building, but then you can see a nice amount of leachate coming through. So, and you can also see some pretty fresh, I'm going to say they're tractor treads. you can see some pretty fresh treads driving through here. So you can guess that if this is raw manure, you have leachate, so you have this manure slurry, if you will, coming off, and then tractors are going to drive through. Where's that tractor going? Is it going into the packing house? Is it going back into the field? So thinking about some of these handling recommendations. And then similarly, we have storage. So again, minimizing leaching, wind. This is something I know in Southern California can get quite windy. The Santa Anas, that often I'll drive around and I'll see composting piles under tarps or something to just try to minimize drift. And then also trying to minimize contamination between raw manure, finished compost, and those soil amendments that are still being treated. So thinking about when you're handling those soil amendments on the farm, potentially starting off with the finished compost. I often see that because if you're going to have a front end loader or some way of turning that windrow pile, starting off with the finished compost, moving to through the process, the compost that's still being processed, and then ending with the raw manure. So you don't go the opposite way and potentially contaminate your equipment and your finished compost. And then also, minimizing animal access to compost piles. And this is a photo of, this was actually in Maine, of a composting facility that I was visiting. And they were composting seafood, as you can see. So there's a lot of seagulls on this pile, but thinking about ways to minimize animal access to compost piles. And I very briefly wanted to mention this FDA report that just came out yesterday. So I'm still kind of interpreting it. But this was a FDA report on factors potentially contributing to the contamination of leafy greens implicated in the fall 2020 outbreak of E. coli 0157H7. And I pulled apart and I highlighted in orange some of the key phrases that I had seen. So FDA's leading hypothesis is that cattle are most likely the sources of outbreak strains of E. coli associated with the 2019 and 2020 leafy greens outbreaks. Those were the outbreaks that were in Santa Maria region and the Salinas region of California. And the consistent recovery of outbreak strains in cattle feces demonstrates that these human pathogens are in environments which surround produce growing fields. So this kind of gets into more adjacent land use and domesticated animals, but cattle poop, we're talking about cattle feces. So I just kind of wanted to put this bug in your ear of a very current topic, because this report just came out yesterday, to consider when we talk about untreated soil amendments and using them on produce growing areas. So just something to consider because it is very, very recent. Okay, and then the last thing that I want to talk about is documentation requirements. And we will revisit this again next week when we talk more about compost. But when we talk about documentation requirements, we recommend that growers keep records of soil amendment use. So just what soil amendments are being used on the farm. Is it treated? Is it untreated? Where are you sourcing it from? Rates and dates of application. I know this is often required for other parts of farming, not specifically the produce safety rule. But if any of you are composting or purchasing compost, then there are some specific documentation or record keeping requirements. And Aaron's going to go into, I think, a little bit more about this. But if composting on the farm, you are required to keep records of the composting treatment process, such as time, temperature, and turning. And we have an example template. Once I finish, I'll drop some links in the chat box. But the top right is a compost treatment record, just a template that you have the option of using. And then if any of you are purchasing compost from a third-party supplier, it must have a certificate of conformance provided by the seller. And we actually do have a fact sheet on these requirements specifically. So you can see we have a little, in the bottom right, here's a snapshot of those requirements, or a fact sheet that outlines those requirements. And we developed this fact sheet in a way that growers could hand it off to their compost suppliers and say, here's some information, here's why I'm asking you for a certificate of conformance. And one of the things that fact sheet includes is a template certificate of conformance. And we essentially tried to draft this in a way that it was open-ended and relatively simple to fill out, just to give them some idea, because we have received some feedback from the industry saying, we don't really know where to start with developing a certificate of conformance, especially for small businesses. Okay, so with that, I am going to just, a number of these slides were developed for a OREI project. So I just wanted to thank a number of the collaborators that have been participating in the project. And I will leave you with our Produce Safety Alliance website, because if you are looking for additional resources, we always post them up on the Produce Safety Alliance website.